Thank you very much to everyone who is joining us this evening. Thank you to our usual UA Debate Series crowd. As you'll see from our setup tonight, our setup is a little different than what we usually have. Rather than having four debaters who are going to be on either side of an issue, we have a very special guest this evening, Professor Stanley Fish. Before we get into our conversation this evening, just a few announcements. From our last debate, we'd like to announce our winners. Our last debate with the resolution, "Gun rights are essential to a free society." The team on the negative ended up receiving the biggest audience swing. And so congratulations to Vincent Hasso and to Finley Dutton-Reed for successfully arguing their side. And congratulations to all of our debaters for doing such a wonderful job. This evening, you are welcome to post your questions for our distinguished guest, and I'd like to introduce him now. Whether literary theory or fishing expedition, our guest speaker, Stanley Fish, has mastered it all. From teaching humanities and law at Florida International University to serving as Dean Emeritus at the University of Illinois Chicago, Mr. Fish has lent his overwhelming ocean of knowledge to students all over the country. Known for his reader response criticism, Stanley Fish has managed to excite his readers into critically reviewing his text rather than simply interpreting it. Professor Fish is the author of There is No Such Thing as Free Speech, Winning Arguments, and most recently, The First, How to Think About Hate Speech, Campus Speech, Religious Speech, Fake News, Post-Truth, and Donald Trump. He is a man of preeminent legal scholarship, and we are honored to welcome our distinguished guest, Professor Stanley Fish, to the University of Arizona. Welcome, Professor Fish.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
We are honored to have you. As I said in the introduction, you're both a literary critic, but you're also a First Amendment scholar, and we wanted to talk largely about the First Amendment and free speech this evening. What I wanted to sort of get our viewers acquainted with first is that you have a pretty unique perspective in terms of how it is that we view the First Amendment. And in your most recent book, which seems to be, in a lot of ways, a continuation of your earlier work, There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, you seem to make two different theses at the same time. The first being that free speech actually isn't really a thing. It's just sort of a concept that is constantly sort of malleable and, as you put it, sort of a political prize to be won. And the second that you contest is that actually is a good thing. So if we could just start, if you could illuminate our viewers about your particular sort of angle on the concept of the First Amendment, free speech, and sort of the way that those two things are distinct.
Let me respond, if I could, by reading a couple of sentences
Please,
from the first chapter.
Thank you.
Here's a thesis sentence. The phrase free speech does not refer to a single core doctrine that works itself out in different practices. Rather, different practices with their in-place definitions and goals determine in any instance what free speech means, if it means anything. So that rather than free speech being a floating abstraction that plugs itself into any situation in which human beings find themselves, free speech is a concept that varies both in its shape and in its operations with different practices. Another way to put this is to say that free speech is a rhetoric. And by that I mean that freedom of speech comes along with a whole host of assumed distinctions, like distinction between speech and action, and familiar props to its argument, like the marketplace of ideas. And so learning about free speech is learning about that rhetoric. What are the components of the rhetorical performance that we call free speech? And in what context does that rhetorical performance figure strongly? And in what context does it figure perhaps less strongly? So, for example, the title of the third chapter of this book, why freedom of speech is not an academic value. And a lot of people, of course, have assumed that freedom of speech is a preeminently academic value. But my argument is that freedom of speech plays as a value, plays almost no role in the academy, and that it should not play any role in the academy. So then you get a kind of sense of what we're talking about. We're talking about a malleable, shifting, protean rhetoric that has been put to many uses in the history of our country, and no doubt will be put to many more uses that we haven't yet today imagined. The second point is, again, something that you referred to when I say free speech is not a fixed doctrine at all. It's a grab bag of analogies, invented for the occasion arguments, rhetorical slogans like the marketplace of ideas or the more speech, the better, shaky distinctions like the distinction between speech and action, and then ad hoc exceptions to those distinctions. All of this combining to make free speech of the very politics it supposedly transcends. And then I point out that what I've just said is rather abstract, and I try to make it more concrete by saying that the First Amendment is a participant in the partisan battle, a prize in the political wars. It is not an apolitical oasis of principle on which we can rely in an abstract way. And that's one thesis of the book. But the second thesis is that there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the First Amendment not being a fixed, categorical, abstract thing, but a fluid set of rhetorical components. Because as a fluid set of rhetorical components, the First Amendment can do a great deal of work for us when we wanted to do that kind of work. The amendment can display a flexibility that enables us to make sense of the many situations in which debates about speech emerge. But that sense will always be contingent, will always be local, could always be revised. And finally, I say the very malleability of the First Amendment, its lack of a hard center or of any center at all, may be its greatest recommendation, may be what makes it useful to us in many contexts. So I'm sorry for having visited upon you and those participating here such a torrent of words, but I thought it might be helpful.
It is absolutely helpful. I think it's vital because again, it's a unique perspective, especially in the commonplace discussions that have to do with the First Amendment and free speech right now. They tend to be partisan, or they tend to be pretty absolutist. And as you point out in your book, they tend to sort of be either free speech is good or free speech is bad. And I think that that's a real reduction. So it's important that we get a really elaborate sort of version of what your viewpoint is. So I think that there's a lot to unpack in what you've just said. And I want to start, because we're on a college campus, with your point about campus speech, which, as you said, is in chapter 3 of your book. So campus speech, you make a lot of distinctions in that chapter, one being within the classroom versus extracurricular speech. Another being the concept of speech that's for an educational purpose versus speech for the purpose of being free speech for its own purpose. So I'd like to talk first about how it is that you're suggesting that in the classroom, free speech doesn't really exist, and how it is that we sort of put proper regulations and confines on speech within the classroom, or at least within departments and committees and things.
In fact, I would say that if free speech were allowed to rule or even figure strongly in the classroom, it would ruin the classroom because it would undermine the purpose of a classroom, which is to engage in education. And education involves, among other things, the introduction to students of materials they were previously unfamiliar with, or at least relatively unfamiliar with, and then the equipping of those students with various tools of analysis that might enable them to do research on their own when the course is over. Those demands, the demands of education, are not the demands of free speech, and are in fact, I think, at odds with the demands of free speech. But let me back up and make another distinction, which I hope will illustrate and clarify what I said a moment ago. And that's the distinction between freedom of speech and freedom of inquiry. Freedom of speech is a political value. It's a political value identified with the form of government known as democracy. And it's tied to the idea that in a democracy, all voices should be given equal access. Each voice deserves to be heard. No voices should be turned away in advance, and no voices should be anointed in advance as the only ones we should listen to. And that's free speech in a democracy. But freedom of inquiry is exactly the opposite of everything that I've just said about free speech in a democracy. Because what freedom of inquiry involves and demands is a reasoned and academic and truly informed inquiry into the kinds of questions and issues that we find in the physical sciences and in the social sciences and in the humanities. And in order for that inquiry to be conducted, it's absolutely necessary that some voices be silenced and sent away, while other voices are allowed the privilege of speaking and being heard. And indeed, the machinery of the academy is geared to do exactly that. Promotion committees, hiring committees, university learned journals, university presses. All of these are involved in deciding what voices won't be heard. We won't promote you. We won't hire you. We won't publish your book or article. Why? Because what the logic and ethos of inquiry demands is a high level of intelligence and academic responsibility, so that the business of the academy is trying to identify those who rise to that high level and to send away or silence, if you prefer, those who do not. So in that general sense, you can see, I hope, that freedom of inquiry is necessarily the ruling imperative in the academy, and that freedom of speech in which all voices would be heard just because they're voices is antithetical to reasoned inquiry.
So clearly, you're drawing a sort of hierarchy of academia, right, where the professor is able to have his or her voice elevated above the students. The hiring committee have their voices elevated above people who they're considering. What happens when we have students who essentially are supposed to be egalitarian, that we have all students sort of their voices are equal? What happens when a professor seems to be preferencing certain voices or certain ideologies or certain things amongst their students above others? Does the university have First Amendment or free speech sort of duties to the students?
No, students have no rights whatsoever. Students certainly don't have any First Amendment rights. In fact, the only right that I think a student has, and a right for which he or she should speak up if it has been violated, is the right to competent instruction. If you feel and have evidence for the feeling that you are being instructed by someone who either doesn't know what he or she is talking about or doesn't live up to the protocols of the classroom, comes late, doesn't come at all, doesn't hand out assignments, doesn't correct assignments, doesn't give feedback, and all of the other things that make up what we might call a bad teacher, then you should complain, because it's your right to be instructed by people who are legitimately credentialed. That's the only right you have. But as a student in the classroom, you have no right whatsoever to express your views. You might, in fact, express a view which your instructor then either accepts or wishes to amplify or challenge. But there are certainly occasions when an instructor might say, in a variety of different tones, no, we're not going to talk about that today, or that's not a point of view that is really appropriate to or pertinent to our discussion. Not only has the instructor the right to say those things and thus silence some voices, he or she has an obligation to say those things in order to keep the educational business of the classroom going in a profitable way.
So so a complaint that a student might have that other students are being preferred, that is a complaint more against incompetent instruction than it is against any sort of free speech rights. That
depends. Look, if students are being preferred, I just taught a class today. In any class, there are 3 or 4 or 5, or maybe more if you're lucky, people who are really on their game. They've done the work. They've thought up the questions. They've thought up the objections to the received positions. Are you going to call on them more than you call on the people who haven't read the text or are just blowing off the entire class experience as a game? Of course you are. And indeed, you should. On the other hand, if you called on someone because of his or her, to use the word that you use, ideology, because he or she were a Democrat or a Republican, or a nihilist or an anarchist or a libertarian or something. In other words, if you in fact made your choices on the basis of the identity of your students, you would be performing bad pedagogy. I think anyone would agree. But if you make your choices on the basis of what you think is going to further the discussion and lead to the general illumination of the class, then you are not only on firm ground, you are on necessary ground.
So my head is swimming with like 150 different follow-up questions, but I want to sort of shift directly to the concept of extracurricular speech outside of the classroom, because as again you point out in your book, that is where I think most of the complaints or the discussion about concerns about free speech being threatened on campus, they usually do have to do with either controversial speakers who are coming to speak to an audience, or students protesting those speakers. So if we could talk a little bit about what is the distinction that we make between what happens in the classroom and the sort of limitations on free speech issues there versus what happens extracurricularly.
There are 2 ways to conceptualize that, which seem to me to be profitable. One way is to ask the obvious question, what does extracurricular mean? And the even more obvious answer, it means outside the curriculum. In that sense, what happens after school day is over, panel discussions, visiting, a visiting speaker, a rally, whatever it might be, they are not academic activities. They are not activities in which a group of people are sitting together trying to formulate the answer to an important question in a discipline. They are something else. What is the something else they are? They are entertainment. They're show business. Now, I have nothing against all of these extracurricular activities, although they often are expensive and involve the construction of facilities that might drain the university's coffers. But that's an issue for university administrators. If you're going to have this entertainment show business segment on your campus, because it livens up the scene, makes your students happy in a variety of ways, then you have every right to police it in any way that you choose. You have every right to police the show business component. And if the whole point of the show business component is to provide lively entertainment for students, staff, and some faculty, then what you want to make sure is that the entertainment is lively, not disruptive or destructive. So that's one answer to the question. There's another answer to the question, which was first proposed, I believe, by Yale law professor Robert Post. And what he says is that even extracurricular activities are an extension of the university's mission, because everything that goes on within the university's geographical space is an extension of the university's mission. And therefore, since that is so, you can ask of any proposed talk or event proposed by students or by anyone else, you can ask of any proposed talk or event, does it support or does it undermine or stand to the side of our educational purpose? And when you get the answer to that question, you can also then say yes to this person and this event, and no to that person and that event. So I don't think these are very, I don't think there's anything very profoundly puzzling about these situations. And notice, they're not free speech situations. One of my theses is that there are very few free speech issues on campus. There are issues of administrative responsibility and competence, and there are, of course, issues about academic responsibility and competence, but not very many free speech issues. No one has the right to come to your campus, either to speak or to participate or to perform in some way. And therefore, since no one has that right, no one who is denied a place on your campus can say that his or her free speech rights have been denied.
And so that was actually I'm glad you said that, Professor Fish, because that's one of my follow-up questions I thought of before, is that, I mean, as a faculty member at a university, I completely agree with you. I find that most of the time these are usually, at most, they're kind of dry, pretty kind of boring bureaucratic decisions. They really don't have anything to do with anything as sort of sexy as free speech. So I'd love to ask you, why do you think that they're so often mischaracterized as free speech issues, as censoriousness?
I think that has some relation to what a very eminent free speech scholar, Frederick Schauer, named quite a few years ago as free speech opportunism. And what he meant is that if you want to make a case for a cause or a policy, and you're perhaps not making the headway that you would like to make, attach your cause or policy to the concept of free speech, freedom of speech. Because the concept of freedom of speech has such a resonance, such an iconic presence in our culture, that is, if you can manage to ride on its coattails, you will go a long way to succeeding in your case. So lots of people want lots of things to be free speech issues when they're not free speech issues at all. They are, as you said, administrative decisions related to the unfolding of various processes at the university.
So is that, I mean, you use the term political prize in your book. Is that, do you feel as though that's something that people are doing consciously, that they know that whoever sort of wins the free speech prize is the one who wins the argument? Or do you think that they really do convince themselves that these are free speech issues and that's something that they take them into?
I think there are people involved in this game who have both attitudes. Some of them who are just saying, okay, this is kind of a legal way of going, can we get this case under a free speech rubric? Mm-hmm. Because if we can, our path will be that much smoother. And then there'll be those who really believe, this, although not hitherto unidentified, this is a big free speech issue, and it's important to show that it is one. So I think that those two versions of free speech opportunism are available.
I want to ask one last question about campus speech, only because it's one that I throw to my students all the time, and they really end up kind of struggling with it. And I'd love to hear your response to it. I usually give them this hypothetical where I say, if a group of students decides to protest a controversial speaker on their campus, is that an example of students exercising their First Amendment right to protest, or is that an example of students who are limiting a speaker's right to be heard? I know you've said that they don't really have a right to be heard, but does it feel, because I know that you talk about values in your book, And I'm wondering if that's an instance where we're sort of measuring the value of free protest against the value of free speech.
Well, let me complicate or modify something I said before.
Great.
Students in the classroom don't have any free speech rights, or let's put it away, free speech interests. That's a better word than rights, because rights is another one of those words. Once you hear it, it goes all hazy and a halo forms around it and so forth. So free speech interests are not a part of what students have in the classroom. But free speech interests might well be a part of what happens in an extracurricular setting, because the correct extracurricular setting is designed to produce a variety of responses to whatever has been said, either by a speaker or by a panel of speakers. So, in other words, to return to your word value, the word that you highlighted, value. It's a value of many extracurricular contexts that a variety of voices be heard and heard vigorously. But again, vigorously means strongly, with emphasis. It doesn't mean storming the podium and knocking the speaker down, which has happened on some occasions. It does not mean tearing the furniture up or blocking the fire exits or anything like that. So free speech in an extracurricular setting, fine. That's what keeps the occasion lively. When lively turns into threatening and dangerous, then the line must be drawn. However, drawing the line will involve action by a university, and that action will be in some sense, either strong or weak, a police action. And that means funds, because there are costs to maintaining order and maintaining the line between lively discussion and destructive activity. So that the university must be expert in handling these matters, must have thought them through, must have a set of policies designed to deal with situations should they emerge. And unfortunately, many universities do not. Or I'll put it in the form of a kind of fishy proverb I'm afraid I'm addicted to pronouncing in a fishy way. Most universities have no idea about how to build their own structures. Most university administrators are entirely helpless and hopeless because they have never thought through the nitty-gritty of their profession.
Well, which I mean, just follows exactly what we were speaking about before, which is that I don't know that I necessarily see a lot of administrators who are ideologues, who are, going out and putting in their regulations in place when and if there are regulations because of any sort of political stance. It usually has to do, as you said, a sort of helplessness to the powers that be.
They don't know what to do because they themselves don't understand what free speech is and isn't, what place it might play in a university setting, rather small, and might not. So they say things like free speech, and this you can find this in a lot of mission statements and elsewhere, the University of Chicago, a whole bunch of other places. Free speech is the absolute essence and foundation of a university. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Free speech has a very small role to play in a well-functioning university. But if you're an administrator who has drunk the free speech Kool-Aid, then you'll find yourself with dilemmas, problems. What do I do now? Do I stand free to my free speech principles? Or do I exert the kind of disciplinary action that seems to violate my free speech principles? Well, that's the wrong question. What do I do now should be a question asked in the context of knowing what your job is. And most university administrators don't know what their job is.
And it's usually you use the word balance in your book. It's usually a balancing act sort of between the competing interests of the students, the donors, the parents who are paying tuition. I do want to highlight, you had mentioned sort of the concept that it's it's extracurricularly, students have the right to come out and protest until they get to a point where it might be threatening. And I want to just highlight that word because it might be a good place to sort of transition into the portion of your book where you discuss hate speech. Because I think that one of the real problems is that threatening seems like it's clear to one person and maybe isn't intended so by the speaker. So how do we even define what speech is threatening? Or, I mean, fighting words is the word that is the phrase that's attached to the First Amendment. How do we know, in the context where speech is completely free, how do we know what is threatening speech, what is fighting words? How do we distinguish that?
Well, going back to the extracurricular context, you know that speech is threatening when it's accompanied by the kind of action that knocks people down or tears or breaks up the furniture. And with people saying, we're not going to let you say what you want to say, and in fact, we want to run you out of town or at least run you out of this university space, and then proceed to try to run them out of the university space. There's no doubt at that moment that speech is threatening. Now, there's a more general question, I think, that you're aiming at, which is, when is speech in general thought of as threatening or hateful? And my answer to that question is that the category of hate speech does not have a content. The category of hate speech cannot be filled by anything. There is no such thing as hate speech. If by hate speech you mean utterances of a kind that all rational persons would find disreputable, disagreeable, and even evil. No such categorization is possible, for the very simple reason that people who utter what others would think of as hate speech are in their own minds speaking the truth. Let's take, for example, people who want to demean or diminish populations, ethnic populations, racial populations, perhaps want to demean or diminish women. Now, that kind of speech has been around for a long time.
Or Holocaust deniers, as you point out in your book.
Well, that's a special case. We'll have to put that aside for a moment. Okay. Perhaps we could return to it.
Yes, we will.
But people who say things about groups, about ethnic or religious or racial groups, often believe what they say. So they are not in their own mind uttering hate speech. And what I'm saying is that there is no general perspective from the vantage point of which that we could determine that what they were saying is hate speech. The way I put it in the book at a certain point is I say, hate speech is speech that your enemy says loudly and successfully. Successfully in the sense that he or she, the enemy, gets a lot of people to hear it and believe it. But that doesn't mean that it's hate speech in a way that can be clearly demarcated from other forms of speech. I always return here to a statement made by Oliver Wendell Holmes in dissent in one of his early cases in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Holmes said, "Every idea is an incitement to somebody." Every idea is an incitement to somebody. And what that means is there's no utterance in the entire world that wouldn't be received as hateful by someone. And conversely, no utterance in the entire world that would be received as absolutely true and good by everyone. So hate speech is a moving target. You can't identify it. And if you can't identify it, it's hard to legislate against it if you require for your legislation that you have a specific object or entity you can point to.
Right, because that would be regulating intent, right? And that's kind of a meaningless standard, because as you say, people's intent is very different than the effect that the speech ends up having.
Well, of course, intent is in the law something that can be paramount and significant, especially, let's say, in criminal law, where there's a mens rea requirement. That is, it's required, or at least it's a strongly suggested requirement that the act, in order to be criminal and culpable, must in some way be intended. It can't be accidental or merely the result of a mistake. But those I was speaking about a few moments ago who say things about racial or cultural or ethnic or religious groups that would be characterized as hateful, they intend those statements as true. That's what they intend. Now, they also have secondary intentions. They want to stop those people, whoever they might be, from voting or from holding political office, or any number of other things, or from living in my neighborhood, things like that. So there are effects that attend the speech, but the speech itself can only be labeled hate speech by those who disagree with it.
Well, a complicated example that you give that is certainly relevant in the first chapter of your book, when you're discussing how difficult it is to draw that sort of clear, shiny line from the speech to the actual action. One of the examples you give is the synagogue in Pittsburgh that ended up being attacked, and a lot of media pundits were suggesting that because the person who was attacking it had bumper stickers all over their car pledging allegiance to Donald Trump, that a lot of media pundits were saying, well, that there's obviously a link between President Trump's speech and this action that happened here. But as you point out, that's a kind of a fuzzy thing to say. It's not as clear cut as all that.
No, it isn't. It's not clear cut. But on the other hand, it's reasonable to assume that if something is said over and over again by authoritative figures in our culture, then those who hear it will perhaps act on it and perform acts which they feel are justified because of the source and authority of those who made the statement. But that's not exactly what I'm concerned about in my chapter on hate speech. I'm
right.
more concerned, as I said a moment ago, about whether or not it's a thing, and I'm saying it's not.
Right. So just speaking about hate speech a little bit more, if we have someone who does believe what they're saying but doesn't believe that it's hate speech, is there a point where there's a consensus enough around that person where that one person or this small group, this sort of subgroup decides that what they're saying is true, but the vast majority of the rest of the world has decided that it's not? Is there a point where it can be deemed hateful because so many people are sort of objectively agreeing that it is?
Well, culture can do that. Rather than the law or some kind of decision by some deliberative body.
Sure.
So it can happen in culture that certain kinds of things that used to be said or observations that used to be made are no longer going to be made because they've entered a territory which we might call cringe-worthy territory. People who say those things are now looked at by their fellow citizens with the cringe look. Now, if you are, as I am, a devotee of American movies, and if you particularly like, as I do, movies of the 40s and 50s and 60s, you're going to find a lot of scenes in those movies where attitudes are casually expressed about women, about members of certain religions, about members of certain ethnic populations, which could never be said today. In fact, given the Me Too culture and the cancel culture, saying them today is likely to end your career in some context. So what has done that? That hasn't been done by any decision by a court or any law passed by a legislature. It has been done by the culture, which in some way, and it's hard to personify a culture, but the culture is in some way decided, no, we don't want any more of that around. And anyone who does continue to traffic in that will be, as we say, dissed by the culture.
So would you say, because I mean, it's interesting to me. I know that often we use free speech and the First Amendment interchangeably, those two phrases. But it sounds in a lot of ways like you're suggesting that First Amendment strictly has to do with legal restrictions on people's right to speak. Whereas, as you spoke just now, culturally, sometimes there's, chilled speech. And that is, I know that there was the Harper's letter that was released last October, where a huge amount of academics were signing it, suggesting that our discourse in this country is at a standstill because of exactly the kind of cultural chill that you're talking about. Would you say that there's a distinction between free speech and First Amendment? Do we erroneously use those things interchangeably?
Yeah. Freedom of speech is something that you can affirm in a variety of contexts. Every day in this country, children are saying to their parents who are asking them to do something or asking them to not say something, "Don't I have free speech?" And the answer, of course, is probably no. But people will often, in the context of a discussion or in a situation, affirm or announce that they have free speech rights. And whether or not they do will depend on the structure of the situation and whether the person who is announcing his or her free speech rights is a weighty person in the situation. But First Amendment rights are, as you suggested, codified in law. And they are usually rights that we as individuals have against the government who would wish to silence or censor us. That is, in this country, and this is not true, of course, of all countries, if you wish to say something, this government cannot step in and either prevent you from saying it or punish you for saying it. Now, of course, there are always exceptions like yelling, fire, falsely in a crowded theater, and all the rest of that stuff. But the government in general is not to police, monitor, rank, and sanction or reward your speech. And then the question comes, okay, to what extent does that government, does the inability by law of the government to punish you for what you say or to prevent you from saying it, to what extent does that carry over into other contexts of activity, which are not a matter of law, like what you can and cannot say in your workplace, what you can and cannot say in your book club, and a whole other, any number of imagined contexts that we can all think of. And in those contexts, the concept of free speech is more like a token that you put down, a chip that you put down on the table, and you want to see how much it will buy you. And whereas in the First Amendment context, strictly applied, it's a matter of what the Constitution says the government cannot do.
Which, to that point, and not to move backwards, because I do want to sort of move through the book in a slightly sort of linear way, but you do mention in the book, and I'd love to sort of enlighten our viewers, that there were sort of, you call them sort of 3 stages of free speech throughout our country, and we tend right now to think of free speech as the way that it is now, and the First Amendment right now is the way that it's always been, and we've sort of always. But as you point out, there are a lot of different Supreme Court decisions that have kind of molded exactly how it is that the First Amendment, can or can't restrict certain kinds of speech. If you could briefly summarize sort of what those three stages have been throughout our national history and the First Amendment, that'd be helpful.
First of all, although this may surprise some people, there were not very many free speech cases or First Amendment cases brought until the beginning of the 20th century. Because throughout the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, the prevailing doctrine with respect to speech was something called bad tendency. And what that meant is that there were certain forms of speech, blasphemous speech, other kinds of speech, which were regarded as bad. That is, their effects were bad. They were obviously not a contribution to the social or intellectual life of society, and that they once identified, they received no constitutional protection. So that was a categorical decision about certain forms of speech. They're not worthy of protection. But then we came into a second stage when Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis, justices of the Supreme Court, developed another theory, which was called the clear and present danger theory. Rather than deciding in advance that some forms of speech were not to be allowed because the tendency to be harmful was inherent in them, Brandeis and Holmes said, well, let's wait. Let's see whether or not a certain form of speech does in fact cause or at least imminently threaten the bad effects we wish to resist. So that was the second stage. Now notice in these two stages, the bad tendency theory, or the stage inaugurated by Brandeis and Holmes, the clear and present danger theory, what people were interested in were, first, the content of speech. Is it just inherently bad speech? And second, in the Brandeis and Holmes argument, the effects of speech. If it's allowed to flourish, might it have bad effects that we would wish to prevent? The third stage of this little history, which is of course very sketchy, and there are many qualifications that would have to be made if this were a scholarly treatise. In the third stage, the concern with both content and effect is abandoned and is replaced by a valuation, a positive valuation of speech in and of itself, no matter what its content, no matter what its effect. And that was largely the work of the case called New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964. And the specifics of the case, while interesting, are not to the point here. What is interesting is that in New York Times versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court decided that falsehoods and, in certain contexts, defamations and other forms of speech that have usually been considered as not rising to the level of constitutional protection should in fact be constitutionally protected because they contribute to a robust, wide open, and uninhibited democratic conversation. And that's a quote from the case. Robust, uninhibited, wide open, democratic conversation. So that all forms of speech, therefore, can be seen as contributing to that conversation. At that point, we have the modern free speech doctrine, where speech in and of itself is considered a positive value, no matter what its content or what its effects. Now, I myself am one of the few scholars, I may be the only one in the country, perhaps, who believes that New York Times versus Sullivan was a bad decision. I like the attempt, at least, to distinguish forms of speech on the basis of both content and effect. Because when you replace the content and effect tests with the test, is it speech? And if it is speech, then it must be permitted. then you're going to get decisions like, for example, Citizens United, where campaign speech in the form of extraordinary amounts of money is declared to be on a par with the speech and writings of John Stuart Mill or John Dewey or someone else. And I don't think that has been a good development. The leveling of speech to the point where no matter what it is, as long as it can be identified as a verbal expression, it must be protected. So those are the three stages.
You point out in your book of this sort of vogue phrase that is often thrown around, which is that the solution to bad speech is more speech, right? And you're suggesting here that that's not necessarily the case.
Yes, the modern view of the First Amendment, the one that emerges strongly in New York Times versus Sullivan, and then is refined in some other cases, rests on two statements made earlier than 1964 by Justice Brandeis. One is that sunshine is the best disinfectant.
Right.
That is, if you have forms of speech, if there are forms of speech that you believe to be dangerous and have quote unquote bad tendencies, then what you should do is let them into the light of day. Not suppress them, not drive them underground, but let them into the light of day. Because when they are let into the light of day, people will see them for what they are, and they will be dismissed and rejected. And Brandeis's second statement is just a reformulation of the point. The remedy for bad speech is more speech, not censorship. Again, the faith here is the more speech there is, the more open that speech is, the more it is aired publicly, the less effects it will have because people will see what it is and reject it. And as I put it in the book, the only counter argument to the two Brandeis statements is all of recorded history. Because in all of recorded history, the result of disseminating and publicizing speech of a variety of forms, including perhaps Holocaust denial, which you mentioned before, is not to have those ideas wither in the light of day. Instead, they gain adherents and admirers who had never heard of them before, but now having heard of them say, oh yeah, that sounds pretty interesting to me. So that the idea that the more speech there is, the more winnowing of the good from the bad will be done by the so-called marketplace of ideas is an idea without evidence and contrary to all of human nature.
Well, which I think is probably the perfect place for us to transition into talking about fake news, which, of course, is very much an issue right now, could not be more relevant. And one of the people who makes exactly the case that you're sort of arguing against, that you mentioned in the book, is Mark Zuckerberg. You quote him as at one point saying, one of the reasons why there's resentment in the Middle East is it's not because of any kind of resentment or hatred. It's because they don't have communication or Facebook accounts. And you point out that he's essentially suggesting that if everyone had a Facebook account and we could all talk to each other, then everything would be great and there would be no wars, which of course is not true, right?
No, it is not true. But also Zuckerberg is a particularly prominent instance of someone who says these kinds of things. He comes at the end of a very long tradition in which people have believed that all of the ills of the world, or many of the ills of the world, and certainly the conflicts that lead to war, could be eliminated or at least softened and ameliorated if we had better forms of communication. And by better forms of communication is usually meant forms of communication that are general and abstract and not tied to anyone's particular challengeable point of view. So the idea is if we could fashion a language in a communication system that was free of bias, distortion, prejudice, self-interest, and all the rest, then we could talk to one another in this language, and our talk would be rational, would be companionable, it would be amiable, and we'd all end up in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. That is such bull. That is such nonsense. And of course, but there have been huge amounts of energy expended in the history of these matters trying to devise such a language. There were examples that I talked about in the 16th and 17th century. There were 19th and 20th century examples. There was George Orwell's essay, Politics in the English Language, which I will say here is the worst well-regarded essay ever written by anyone. It is absolutely silly and absurd. But nevertheless, it strikes a chord because it says just what you quoted Zuckerberg as saying. If we can get our language right, the world will be right. Now, of course, what Orwell thought was that too many French and Italian words had made their way into the English language. And he wanted to go back to good old Anglo-Saxon nitty-gritty words. And he said, if we can do that and forget about all of this Italianate and French stuff, we'll be in a position to see things as they really are and say things as they really are. So his linguistic universalism was actually an outshoot of his prejudice against continentals, a prejudice absolutely built in to British society for centuries. Whenever the British find themselves in some difficulty, they always want to blame the French and Italians as being people who are meretricious, over aesthetic, not sound and grounded as English yeomen are. I mean, this is a very old trope. But in whatever form this argument appears, the argument of political salvation by linguistic purification is never going to work, but it always has an appeal.
Well, as evidenced by the fact that, most recently, after last week's election, we have a lot of very literally fake news, or we have a lot of videos that are going viral that are doctored. But we also have, in the wake of that, a lot of complaints about the fact that Twitter and Facebook have actually decided to censor or to at least label a lot of those things. So I guess a question that I could throw at you is, what do we do? Do we want to leave it in the hands of of Mark Zuckerberg and the CEO of Twitter to decide what kind of news qualifies as legitimate and unquestioned? Is that, because those are...
Jack Dawson and Mark Zuckerberg have different ideas about this. And Twitter has at times been more active in labeling fake or undocumented some things that have been said. Zuckerberg has been all over the place. Zuckerberg in my book is a figure of fun, and perhaps unfairly, because it might just be that he's trying to do the best that he can when he appears before Congress for his company, and therefore is making arguments that are designed to placate those members of congressional committees who are angry at Facebook. So he says things about artificial intelligence and so forth. The other possibility to explain his Zuckerberg's performance is that he's stupid. Now, of course, obviously, he's not stupid in an entrepreneurial sense. You can't be stupid in an entrepreneurial sense and amass that kind of fortune and that kind of influence. But all of the things he says about speech are stupid. Now, whether he's saying them strategically or just because he's stupid, I don't know.
Well, but one of the issues that you actually addressed that Zuckerberg specifically has spoken about, and we don't have to talk about Zuckerberg the entire time, but certainly this is a great example. We mentioned this before, is something like Holocaust denial. And as you said, it's something that, we don't want to give that too much sunlight, right? That's sunlight's not a great disinfectant for something like that, exactly because we have the danger of somebody reading something like that and deciding that maybe that's an okay idea. So again, what is the line in terms of those kinds of ideas that are very specifically dangerous, like Holocaust denial?
Yeah, well,
And
I like your phrase specifically dangerous, because what I'm arguing against in the chapter on hate speech and elsewhere is the availability of a general argument which will allow us to isolate hate speech or hateful speech from other forms of speech. On the other hand, we can make historical arguments of a kind that are made by many European countries and also by Canada, where you can say that historically it's the case where this form of speech flourishes, the following bad effects ensue, almost inevitably. Therefore, we want to say that saying these kinds of things is hurtful to civil society, undermines confidence in our institutions and in our system of law, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, we want to curtail that kind of speech. Now, what that kind of speech will be, and this goes back to the first answer to your first question, what that kind of speech will vary with different contexts and in different countries. But I think the empirically, or I forget, what was your phrase again that I seized on?
Specifically dangerous.
The specifically dangerous is an empirical measure. Let's take a look at this. What happens when certain forms of speech? Now, of course, the counter argument to that, and it's a hard argument to dismiss, is that these very forms of speech, which are regarded as specifically dangerous, actually do bear the truth, and that we are suppressing the truth when we suppress them. So then we're back to the Brandeis point of view, that we should allow all forms of speech to flourish and then let the marketplace of ideas in the fullness of time decide. But of course, in the fullness of time, we might all be dead.
I don't want to keep you too much longer because we've been talking for an hour already.
I'm not going anywhere.
Excellent. So I want to talk about one last point that you make in your book, and then, if you don't mind, we just have a couple of audience questions. So obviously, again, in the wake of last week's election, you end your book by talking about both post-truth and Donald Trump. So if we could talk a little bit about in the time since the book came out, we would now have this election where we might not only have a post-truth world but also a post-Trump world. So if you could discuss a little bit about sort of your concept of free speech and how it works with a figure like Donald Trump, and how it might sort of evolve or devolve or shift at all now that he's out of office.
Well, what we're looking at is the possibility of the Avignon papacy. That is, we'll have the Pope in Rome and the Pope in Avignon, as was the case for a number of years. But let me get back up and say that a phenomenon like so-called fake news is a matter of concern, largely because the institutions that we have always relied on to make distinctions and to give us authoritative accounts have now become the object of distrust. That is, there's more and more distrust of major networks, TV networks, or even cable TV networks, of mainstream newspapers like the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, etc. More and more distrust of university experts who are dismissed as elites and as know-nothings, in a way that takes us back to the rantings of Spiro Agnew, Vice President of the United States, many years ago. Now, the opposite of fake news is often assumed to be true and accurate news. But that opposite entity doesn't exist, cannot be identified. The difference between those who pursue or traffic in fake news and those who don't is that those who don't aspire to an objectivity and an accuracy that may never finally be achieved. But nevertheless, the aspiration itself acts as a check on the most intemperate and dangerous of utterances. If, on the other hand, you have people who don't care what they say and have no sense of wishing to be faithful or faithful to truth or wishing to be accurate, then those people are dangerous. We call them demagogues, we call them trolls, we have a whole lots of names for them. So the remedy for fake news is not to insist that we deliver only true news, because again, that's not an entity that's available to us. The remedy for fake news is to re-strengthen our confidence and our trust in the institutions that have always provided us with the basis and base of information that we can rely on. Again, universities, major newspapers, libraries, the Library of Congress, the Census Bureau, various professional associations, medical association or American Association of Lawyers, or things like that. If we can restore somehow, and I don't exactly know how to do that except from the top down.
Well, that's what I was just going to ask is, do you feel that that's the responsibility of those institutions to earn that trust back? Like, do you feel that it's a distrust that's well earned by those institutions?
No, I don't think the distrust has been well earned by the institutions. I think, for example, the institution that I know best is the Academy. Everyone that I've ever known in my academic life, which is now in its 57th or 8th year, everyone that I've ever known in academic life is sincerely devoted to getting it right. Now, that doesn't mean that academics haven't been attacked from both the left and the right for all kinds of sins. But in general, they don't deserve the attack. In general, they don't deserve the attack.
Sure.
And the question is, what can be done to ward off the attack? And the answer, I think, the only answer I can think of, and it's not a particularly strong answer, so I apologize for it in advance. We must have national leaders who are themselves cheerleaders for those institutions.
Sure.
So that we can return to that time when Walter Cronkite, the anchor person for CBS News, would sign off every night, sign his broadcast off every night by saying, "And that's the way it is." And people believed him.
Most trusted man in America.
Not because it was always that way. He no doubt misreported things in his time, but because everyone knew that that's what he was trying to do, to get it the way it is. And we have to once again recognize that there are a lot of people and institutions who are trying to do that. So that, for example, we have to, in some way, reinforce the authority of the Dr. Faucis of this world, whether they're in medicine or in the academy or in professional associations or in libraries, wherever they are. And if that happens, there'll still be a lot of fake news produced by persons who don't care what they're saying, but just want to cause problems. But there will be a residue of trust in our basic institutions, which seems to have been frayed in recent years.
Well, isolating journalism specifically, I know that this isn't sort of like this seems like it's sort of an umbrella kind of solution remedy, and I know that you're sort of advocating for a more sort of holistic kind of we all sort of get to restore our faith. But what would you think of? What are your thoughts on something like the fairness doctrine being reenacted so that we are holding our cable news networks to very specific standards of balance, so that it actually is written within the law rather than something that we just sort of give faith to, so that we don't have 24-hour news networks that are sort of just free market capitalists who are saying, whoever can get the most eyeballs ends up winning the day.
Well, one of the problems with the fairness doctrine was that it seemed to call for the inclusion of any voice.
Mm-hmm.
That is, the fairness doctrine, and fairness is a liberal virtue, and liberalism is incapable of making distinctions. That's, of course, it's both its weakness and its strength. So the fairness doctrine is a typical liberal doctrine. It says every voice should be heard, and the problem is there are too many voices. So the fairness doctrine is just another version of the more speech, the better. And I don't believe in that.
As we've discussed. So, Professor Fish, if I could throw a couple of audience questions at you, and then I'll get your final thoughts. So, Sean in Washington, D.C. wants to specifically ask about the concept of political correctness. I think the question here is, if I can sort of rephrase the way that it's written here, I think the question here is political correctness something that is a threat to free speech, or is that another one of those kind of buzzword concepts that is trying to sort of lampoon free speech, but actually political correctness isn't as big a threat as we seem to think?
Well, political correctness is something that people could be accused of. Was originally directed at universities and at teachers in classrooms and in the way that classrooms are conducted. To the extent that professors bring in their political views to the classroom and allow them to be known, even if they just allow them to be known and don't try to persuade students to them. To that extent, there's something called political correctness in the university world, and it should not be allowed. It should be stamped out. No instructor should ever allow his political views to surface, and certainly never use the platform of the podium to present his or her political views. Now, when shifting to the larger context of the society as a whole, political correctness seems to mean something like what I referred to earlier when I mentioned the cancel culture, which also has a very prominent place on some campuses, is that when you say something that at least some people believe is out of line, you will be silenced and canceled. Now, as I suggested a while ago, that will be the effect in time of the work that culture does to winnow out what is acceptable to say from what it is not acceptable to say. But now we have a whole bunch of people who are in the business of canceling each other. That is, who are in the business of discovering utterances made by someone and that utterance demonstrates that this is a person who should be canceled. I'm not sure, because I am not a scholar of these matters, and I don't want to pronounce on something that I don't really know that much about. But I'm not sure how far cancel culture extends. I'm not sure that cancel culture extends further than the blogs and internet sites in which the various acts of canceling are reported and performed. I don't know. Do you think it's a larger phenomenon in the society?
Funny you say. Our first forum actually of this semester was on cancel culture. We wanted to address that. I know that it's something that I know that that Generation Z, my students, are particularly concerned with. But what's odd to me is that I don't necessarily see an overwhelming sort of pro or con on it. I see that students seem to be split directly down the middle. That there's a 50-50 split in terms of people who think that cancel culture is a really great phenomenon, or that it's not. But as you're saying, I don't know that I see it as a phenomenon that actually is having any kind of real tangible effect. I think that there's an overblown sense of censoriousness, or that people are having their rights restricted when they really aren't. It's really mostly public figures who they still have a public platform just like they did before, and no one really is ever canceled, I would say.
Now, in the classroom, of course, nothing like cancel culture has a place.
Right, right.
In the classroom, that is, ideas that are put forward are ideas, and then they're to be considered and discussed. And someone who does advance an idea should not, therefore, be canceled or silenced because of that idea before it has undergone the scrutiny of deliberative inquiry, which is, as I said earlier, the business of the academy.
Which I think is a good transition to our second audience question from Akash, which is if, as you say, censoriousness and standards of appropriateness are what give language meaning, that we are able to give it meaning in different contexts, how do we decide which authorities set those standards, and how do we decide who is able to make that censorship?
I don't think that's a decision made in, let's say, in the context of some vote or other. I refer again to the Walter Cronkite phenomenon. People who watched Walter Cronkite didn't decide to trust him. It was just built into the culture. Sure. So if it's built into the culture that someone like Walter Cronkite or someone like Dr. Fauci or some other figure, either in the arts or in the sciences or in business, if it's built into the culture that these people are, as I said earlier, aspiring to get things right, then the decision will not so much be a decision, rather it will be you and I participating in a general culture in which those authorities are acknowledged to be authorities and thought to be more trustworthy than they are untrustworthy.
Excellent, excellent. Professor Fish, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so do you have any last comments or thoughts that you'd like to leave our viewers with? Because we have plenty of students here and faculty who are watching, who I'm sure would love to hear your thoughts on First Amendment principles.
Well, I think, and I thank you for this, a great deal of territory has been covered in our conversation. And I can't think of anything that I would add. I would just reinforce one point. Do not believe that the more speech, the better. Do not believe it. And do not believe it because it's false.
Thank you very much, Professor Fish. Again, we sincerely appreciate your time. And thank you very much for coming and sharing your views with us. Anyone who would like to buy Professor Fish's book, The First, you can go to the Amazon link that's in our comments here. It's an absolutely excellent read, as are all of his works. So please make sure that you do that. Again, if you have any follow-up questions, you're more than welcome to leave them in the comments. Thank you so much, Professor Fish. I'm going to sign off right now, and you can.
They can email me too. People can email me.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you very much for that offer. We'll make sure that we put your email out there too. So I'm going to sign off of this, Professor Fish. If you can hang on for one more minute after we sign off, that would be great. Thank you very much to all of our viewers, and we will be back in the spring. This is our final event for the semester, and I can't imagine anything better. Thank you very much for viewing, and we'll see you next time.